As we move forward in Unit 2, looking at political inputs, we've just covered public opinion and voting as a metric of influence that we hold as citizens. Now we expand our view outward and look at outside institutions that can have an effect on our politics and governance. And the first we aim to look at is American media. How does the media affect politics? So, our media comes in a variety of formats. The United States of America has been the leading innovator across the 20th and 21st century in terms of technology that we use to communicate. We began with print media, what we call newspaper journalism, early on in our nation's history, at the very founding. We were utilizing print media and mediums to connect people and communicate policy. The invention of the radio in the wartime era gave direct access to our political officials, namely the president, to communicate directly with the American people. We were able to listen to a lot of information directly from our government and systems of government that we had never been able to do before. Then we moved into the television era. In 1955, we invent the television and everything changes. Post the invention of television, our public opinions and the influence that we have in terms of politics and policy starts to change because we can see it in real time. As the decades move on, we change that style of television in the 1980s to cable television, in which we are allowed to package and digest our own selected forms of media biasly in the ways and formats we see fit. As we've moved on beyond that, we've expanded into an entirely Wild West medium and the dot-com boom of the 1990s and early 2000s known as the internet, where we have been able to expand our ability to connect with people, digest information, true and false, through a wide open network known as the internet, social media, and other entities. Now, as we've gone through time, we've developed very large stream giants that dictate these types of media, right? In television, we've got CBS and NBC, which were formatted by the federal government to help organize a lot of local television stations that were developing all over the country. As we move into the cable era, organizations such as CNN, which stands for the Cable News Network, gave you the news 24 hours a day for the first time in your life. Before that, you only got the news after dinner or in the morning, right? 2 segments during the day where you got the beginning information and the ending information like everybody else. Now you're getting it streamlined into your home. With the invention of the internet, we changed the way we digested print media. Now we digest it mainly technologically on the internet. So the New York Times, BBC, Fox News, Politico, CBSN, and others now all target your eyes and attention online rather in that print medium. We've tried to create certain types of regulations to ensure that these media mediums remain fair and efficient in terms of their engagement with politics, radio and television especially. We've created things like the equal time rule, which allows each candidate equal time in their selected medium, the fairness doctrine, which ensures that certain types of news organizations cover stories equally and within measure of one another. We also have certain types of regulations for indecency, slander, libel, protections of your First Amendment, and so on. It won't be until the Telecommunications Act of 1996 that we really start to change our behaviors and attitudes towards media. At that time, this act changed the ability of news organizations to consolidate with one another in what we call a monopoly. Although monopolies and antitrust laws are prevented here in the United States of America, or through antitrust laws, I should say, here in America, the Telecommunications Act of 1996 allowed the conglomeration of multimedia companies. So we went from a large scale of variety between 40 and 50 entities to get our media to then 12, to then 6, to then 5. The organizations that were meant to regulate this and monitor this have become less and less effective and have been given less and less authority since the creation of this act. And the fairness and coverage of what we refer to as net neutrality across these platforms has differed into a unique bias. Your textbook in our lecture gives you a unique perspective of this. In the 1980s, under the Reagan administration, you had a variety of outlets in which to seek information. Now that has become incredibly limited to 6 major conglomerates that own 90% of American media. These 6 entities spend a large amount of money to consume their rivals and the smaller networks around them into a practice known as conglomeration or monopoly, where they are all ending up under the same umbrella. And what happens is when you're watching any variety of these networks, CNN, NBC, ESPN, BET, Hulu, even streaming services, you are still in the apparatus of one of these 6 entities. Okay? It's very important to make note of. This is not new in the United States of America. We also conglomerate the organizations that make our food. This is why when you see on the news that there's a listeria outbreak in bags of lettuce, everyone in America has to throw their lettuce away. It's because the same 6 people are making it, right? We do this also in what we consume in our consumables, such as clothes, right? We have the same several entities that make all of your name brand fashion, and of course the same dozen companies that make every vehicle on the road. So conglomeration is not new to the United States of America, but it's important to note that it does have a very strong implication when we go from just the stuff we buy to the information we digest. We call this a monopoly. We've all played this highly frustrating board game where you attempt to control the entire board, right? That's what monopoly is, and that's what concentrated ownership creates. It creates this monopolistic behavior in which only a few entities are where you can derive the information you digest, which leads to bias or censorship within the media. I've included a link here that shows what some of this concentrated ownership looks like amongst the Sinclair Group, which owns all local media stations in America. Now, this is important because the function of media is not meant to be biased, coerced, or concentrated, right? It's meant to be what we call the fourth estate, or this fourth institution of government that is there to keep everybody on check and balance, to be the whistleblower for the American public. However, over time, media outlets have also had to derive revenue, right? They cannot just be the oath and truth keepers of America without being able to pay their journalists and keep the lights on. And so this drive for revenue, with the invention of advertising in the 1950s, has created this very cyclical relationship in which they are now trying to develop revenue through advertising and gaining your viewership of a particular story, which leads us farther and farther away of the story needing to be unbiased, truthful, factual, and informational, and now it's moving towards a realm of being sensational, eye-gripping, and connected to advertising. And because of this, the media will set an agenda based off that revenue that's necessary. We call that agenda setting, the act of choosing which issues or topics deserve your attention. Because if they're taking money from Starbucks, McDonald's, and Burger King, they probably don't want you talking about stories about raising the minimum wage for service workers. And so you won't, right? That affects the agenda that media has. Media bias has some effect on the public. Most of it is subtle. We don't notice it. However, a great deal of our media organizations do frame a lot of their discussions, which is where they create the narrative or context of a news story, which we've seen all too often in the modern era, and it affects the way you digest information. It can come through 2 lenses, episodic framing and thematic framing. Episodic framing focuses on isolated details rather than the broad issue. So if we're going to talk about the border, the southern border, some Democrat lawmakers will focus on the individual stories of migrants crossing the border and the sad stories and trials that they have encountered without looking at the broader issue of immigration policy as a whole. Whereas there is another view, like thematic framing, which is a broad look at the issue but skips the numbers and details. The war on Gaza is a great example of this, as some of our Republican lawmakers focus heavily on the broader issue of defeating Hamas or defeating this terrorist group without actually looking at the statistics and numbers of how many innocent civilians have been affected by those decisions. Okay, so coverage at any time can be very episodic or thematic, and it creates the generalizations you make when digesting media. They are priming you, in a way. Priming is when the media covers predispositions of the viewer or reader in a particular way to get you feeling a certain way about that particular issue. And that seems to be happening more and more with the way our media is provided to us. The framing effect is shown here in this great graphic example where we have two forms of meat from the grocery store aisle. One is framed as 80% lean, the other is 20% fat. One looks more negative than the other, even though they are the exact same product. One is predisposed or framed as positive, while the other is predisposed as negative. Now, because of this, our media can fall on a very unique spectrum, meaning that no matter what you're watching, it falls on some categorical line just like we do in terms of political ideology, bias, attitude, belief, and opinion. Now we move on to looking at political parties, which we will begin in the next video.